My wife left me for a rich man on Christmas Eve. A year later, she begged to come back. Christmas Eve with a bow on it. I used to think 7 years meant something, like a sturdy table you could lean on, not fancy but reliable. My wife and I built our life the slow way. Coffee in the morning, joint grocery lists. The same dumb argument about whether the thermostat was a weapon. I ran a small business that did well for a while, not private jet well, but mortgage paid, vacations planned, birthdays handled without panic. Then the year everything got loud, suppliers got flaky, a contract I counted on evaporated, 2 clients suddenly remembered they had cousins who could do it cheaper, and my income dropped like it had tripped over its own feet. I told myself it was temporary, because that is what you tell yourself when you are watching numbers shrink and still trying to smile like a person who sleeps. My wife started dressing sharper, not in a fun way, in a ready-for-inspection way. She started staying out later, and the excuses got weirdly detailed, the kind of detail people add when they're trying to build a wall out of words. I was tired. That is the truth. I was tired and I was proud. And I did not want to be the guy who checks phones or counts minutes. I wanted to be the guy who trusts his partner and fixes his business and keeps the house warm. I did not know trust can be a rug you stand on while someone quietly pulls the floor out. Christmas Eve came with the usual pressure. Like the whole world expects you to sparkle on command, I was finishing a last-minute invoice at the kitchen table. Our small tree blinked like it was trying to stay optimistic. My wife moved around the apartment with that stiff politeness people use at weddings and funerals. She set 2 mugs down, but she did not sit. She stood by the counter, hands folded, eyes fixed on a spot behind my head, and the air felt too clean, like someone had opened a window in the middle of winter. She said we need to talk, and I swear my brain tried to bargain with reality. Maybe she wants to postpone her parents tomorrow. Maybe she is pregnant. Maybe she wants a dog. My mind ran through safe options like a shopper looking for the cheapest item. Then she said it. I am leaving. I blinked, because that sentence does not belong in a home where the stockings are hung. I asked, what do you mean leaving? She said it again, slower, like I was a customer who did not understand the return policy. I am leaving you. I stared at her, waiting for the part where she laughs and says she is stressed. But her face was calm, not sad calm, not guilty calm, business calm. The kind of calm that tells you this conversation started in her head weeks ago. I felt my hands go cold on the edge of the table. I said, why? And she exhaled like I had asked the most exhausting question in the world. Then she said the words that still sit in my memory like broken ornaments. I have been seeing someone else. My throat tightened. I heard the tree lights buzzing. I did not know they made noise until that moment. I managed to say, since when? She looked away finally, not because she felt bad, but because she was calculating. She said it has been a while, and I did not ask what a while meant, because I was afraid the answer would put a number on my stupidity. I remember saying, are you serious? Like that question could rewind time. She said yes, and then, as if she was delivering a motivational speech to a stranger, she added, you are not rich enough for the life I want. And before I could even process the insult, she finished it. I do not see a future with you anymore. I want you to understand this is not a mistake. It is a decision. I sat there like my body had forgotten what posture means. My first instinct was to argue, to list all the things I had done, all the nights I stayed up working, all the plans we made, but my mouth would not cooperate. It was like my pride and my grief were wrestling for control, and neither was winning. I just said, who is he? She hesitated for half a second, and that half second told me everything. She said his name like it was supposed to impress me, and it did. In the worst way, because I recognized it from the stories she had started telling lately. The generous friend, the mentor, the man who knew the best restaurants and always paid, the man who had a watch that looked like it had its own security team. She said he can give me stability, and I almost laughed, because stability was what she called money, and money was what she called love. I asked, did you ever love me? And she rolled her eyes just a little, like love was an outdated app on her phone. She said, I cared about you, but caring is not enough. Not when I am wasting my time waiting for you to get back on top. And that was the part that hit hardest, not the cheating, not even the leaving, but the way she spoke like my struggle was an inconvenience to her schedule, like my worst year was a delay in her personal timeline. I felt something in me go quiet, not dead, just quiet, like a door closing gently inside my chest. I said, so this is it. On Christmas Eve, she said there is never a good time. And I thought, you picked the most symbolic time possible, like you wanted the holiday lights to witness it. She reached into her purse and pulled out papers, already printed, already organized, divorce papers. As if she had planned this like a business meeting. I stared at the papers, then at her, and I realized I did not even know who I was looking at anymore. She said, you can keep the apartment, keep the car, keep everything. I do not want to fight. I just want out. I wanted to ask how she could afford to be generous. Then I remembered. She was not being generous. She was being efficient. She was buying a clean exit. I took the papers with hands that did not feel like mine. I said nothing, because if I spoke I might beg or scream, and I was not going to do either. Not for her. Not for the version of me she had already replaced. She watched me, waiting for a reaction she could label and use later. Tears would make her feel powerful. Anger would make her feel justified. So, I gave her the one thing she could not use, silence. She swallowed, grabbed her coat, and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the knob, and for a second I thought she might turn back, not out of love, but out of habit. Then she said, "You will be fine," and I heard the door close, not loudly, not dramatically, just a soft click, like the ending of a sentence, and I sat there in the blinking light of our tree, listening to the city outside pretend it was still a celebration, and I realized I had no idea what my life was going to be after tonight, and that scared me, but not as much as the strange calm that followed, because under the shock and the humiliation, something else started to form, a thought I could not name yet, a small stubborn spark that whispered, "You do not get to decide my future for me." The quiet after the door. The first thing that surprised me was how loud silence can be. The apartment felt bigger and emptier at the same time, like the walls had taken a step back to watch me react. I stayed at the table long after the tree light stopped blinking. My phone buzzed a few times, probably people wishing us a Merry Christmas. I did not check. I was afraid of seeing her name light up like nothing had happened. Eventually I stood up, not because I felt ready, but because my legs reminded me they still existed. I walked through the room slowly, noticing things I had not seen in years. A chipped mug she refused to throw away, a stack of magazines she never read, a photo of us from our second anniversary where we both looked tired but proud. I turned that frame face down, not dramatically, just carefully, like you do with something fragile you cannot deal with yet. That night, I slept on the couch even though the bed was empty, not out of sadness, but because the couch felt neutral. It had no expectations. The next morning was Christmas Day, and it arrived with zero respect for my emotional situation. Sunlight came through the window like it was still invited. My phone had 12 missed calls, my parents, her sister, 2 friends who knew something was wrong before I did. I texted my parents a simple "We are separating. I will explain later." Then I put the phone down again. I made coffee for one out of habit, then poured half of it down the sink when I realized I did not need to share anymore. The words separating felt dishonest, but I did not have the energy for the truth yet. The divorce moved faster than my brain could keep up with. She had already signed everything, no demands, no fights. She even left a short note saying, "I hope you understand this is for the best," which was impressive considering I did not understand anything at that point. People kept telling me I was lucky she left me everything, the apartment, the car, even the emergency fund, as if material things could act as emotional shock absorbers. I nodded and thanked them because that is what polite adults do. But inside I felt like someone had handed me a perfectly wrapped box that was completely empty. The weeks after blurred together. I went to work. I answered emails. I smiled at clients. And every evening I came home to a space that felt paused, like it was waiting for someone who was not coming back. I did not drink myself into oblivion. I did not break things. I did not spiral publicly, not because I was strong, but because something in me refused to give her that story. I refused to become the cautionary tale she would tell her new rich friends about the ex who fell apart. My business was still struggling, worse than before because now every quiet evening left too much room for thinking. I started reviewing contracts with a sharper eye, not because I was motivated, but because focusing on numbers felt safer than focusing on memories. I cut costs brutally, canceled subscriptions, downsized office space, renegotiated with suppliers who suddenly remembered my calls when I stopped being polite. Some days I failed. Some days I stared at my screen for hours without typing a word, but even that felt like progress compared to the numbness of the first week. I heard about her through the city grapevine, how she moved into a high-rise with a view, how her new man drove a car that sounded expensive, how she posted smiling photos that looked professionally staged. I muted her on every platform without drama, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. I did not need daily reminders of a life I was no longer auditioning for. Months passed. Winter turned into a reluctant spring, and something subtle changed. Not happiness, not yet, but structure. I woke up earlier, not to impress anyone, but because mornings felt quieter in mine. I started taking long walks with podcasts about business and psychology, partly for learning, partly to hear voices that were not arguing with my thoughts. One afternoon, I found myself laughing at something stupid I said out loud to no one. and that scared me more than the sadness had, because it meant life was continuing without her approval. The divorce finalized without a single dramatic scene. A judge stamped papers, asked routine questions, and just like that, 7 years became a file number. I walked out of that building lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because the waiting was over, heavier because now there were no excuses left. It was just me and whatever came next. I did not know then that this was the bottom, not because I was broken, but because everything unnecessary had been stripped away. I stood on my apartment balcony that night, city lights flickering like impatient thoughts, and I made a quiet promise to myself, not to get revenge, not to prove her wrong, but to rebuild something that did not depend on being chosen by someone who left when things got hard. And at the time I thought that promise was small, almost pathetic. I had no idea it was the first brick in something much bigger, the year that refused to stay quiet. People think rebuilding starts with motivation speeches and dramatic decisions. Mine started with spreadsheets and uncomfortable honesty. I looked at my business like it was a stranger who had disappointed me, not with anger, but with curiosity. What worked? What was dead weight? What had I been avoiding because it felt familiar? I realized I had been running things safely, politely, like I was afraid to ask for more, afraid to be told no. Maybe because at home I had already been told no in 1,000 small ways I did not notice at the time. I changed that, not overnight, but deliberately. I stopped chasing clients who drained energy and paid late. I raised prices on projects I knew were undervalued, half, expecting everyone to leave. Some did, and the relief was immediate, like cleaning out a closet and realizing you can breathe again. I invested in a service I had always postponed because it felt risky, and the irony did not escape me. I was finally taking risks after losing the person who said I was not worth waiting for. Spring turned into summer, and something strange happened. Inquiries started coming in without me begging for them. Referrals stacked up. One solid contract led to another, then another, and suddenly my calendar looked busy in a way that felt earned, not desperate. I was working more, but I was sleeping better, because the work had direction now. I ran into her once, accidentally, at a coffee shop I rarely visited. She was standing in line ahead of me, perfectly styled, talking loudly on her phone about travel plans. She turned, saw me, and froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to notice. Then she smiled, the same polished smile she used on strangers, and said hey, like we were old co-workers. I said hey back, paid for my coffee, and wished her a good day. Nothing more, no questions, no tension. And as I walked out, I felt a strange satisfaction, not because I looked successful, but because I felt uninterested, and that was new. Later that year I heard about her life unraveling in pieces, not through gossip, but through concerned whispers. Her rich certainty was not as stable as advertised. The man she left me for drank more than. He smiled, deals fell through, moods swung. The glamour started to look like maintenance. I did not celebrate that. I simply noted it. Like a weather change, my focus stayed narrow. I hired 2 people, then 3, moved into a better office space, not flashy, just functional. Money stopped being a source of constant anxiety and became a tool again, the way it used to be before it turned into a measuring stick for my worth. One evening, almost exactly a year after that Christmas Eve, I sat at the same kitchen table, now with new chairs and a different lamp, and reviewed my accounts. The numbers made me blink, not because they were obscene, but because they were solid, stable, flowing. I leaned back and laughed, not loudly, just enough to release something that had been held tight for months. That was the moment it hit me. She had left thinking she was escaping a sinking ship, but she had jumped right before the tide turned. I did not feel victorious. I felt clear. The next morning I got a message from an old mutual friend, awkwardly phrased, asking if I had heard about her boyfriend. I had not, and I did not ask for details. A few weeks later the news became unavoidable. He had drunk himself into nothing, not dramatically, not suddenly, just steadily, like someone erasing themselves one bad decision at a time. I felt a quiet sadness for him, not because he took my wife, but because he was clearly fighting something money could not drown out. I wondered briefly how she was handling it. Then I caught myself. That chapter was not mine anymore. My life was full again, not of people necessarily, but of purpose, and that was enough, or so I thought, because life has a sense of timing that borders on sarcasm. And just when I felt like the past had finally stopped knocking, it showed up in person, the knock that sounded familiar. It was a Tuesday evening, nothing special, which is usually when life decides to interrupt. I had just finished a call with a new client and was debating whether cereal qualified as dinner when the doorbell rang. I was not expecting anyone, and my first instinct was to ignore it. Peace is addictive once you taste it. But the bell rang again. Patient, not aggressive. I opened the door without thinking too much. And there she was, not the version from social media or the coffee shop, but a quieter version, hair pulled back, eyes tired, wearing confidence like a jacket that no longer fit. For a second neither of us spoke. The hallway light hummed, and I had the strange feeling of seeing a ghost who had not realized they were dead yet. She said my name softly, like she was testing whether it still belonged to me. I did not invite her in. I did not slam the door. I just leaned against the frame and waited. She took a breath and said, "Can we talk?" I smiled, not out of kindness, but out of disbelief. Talk was her favorite word when she wanted something. I said, "About what?" And she looked past me into the apartment, taking inventory without realizing she was doing it. "New furniture, different energy," she said. "About us," and I corrected her. "There is no us." That landed harder than I expected. She flinched, then nodded. "Fair," she said. Then she launched into an apology that had clearly been rehearsed, about stress, about bad timing, about how she had been confused. I listened without interrupting, not because I owed her that, but because I was curious how the story sounded from her mouth now that the ending had changed. She mentioned his death in a careful tone, like it was both a tragedy and an inconvenience. She said she had time to think now, that she realized she had made a mistake, that she missed what we had. And there it was, the word had, past tense, preserved like a museum exhibit. She finally got to the point. She said, "I know things are going well for you now. I have seen it, people talk," and I was impressed by the honesty of that admission. She said, "I want to come back, not just emotionally, but practically." She gestured vaguely, the apartment, the life. I froze, not in fear, but in clarity. She was not asking for forgiveness. She was making an offer. And then she said the line that sealed it. "I am willing to take everything back, start fresh, like nothing happened." For a moment, I pictured an alternate universe where I said yes, where I invited her in, poured 2 coffees, pretended time was elastic. Then I laughed, not cruelly, but honestly, the kind of laugh that escapes when a joke writes itself. She stared at me, confused, maybe offended. I said, "You told me I was not rich enough for your future. Now you want to lease mine." Her face tightened. She said, "That is not fair," and I shrugged. "Maybe not, but it is accurate." She stepped closer, lowered her voice, said we had 7 years, like that was a coupon that never expired. I looked at her and realized something important. She was exactly the same. Only the circumstances had changed, and I was exactly the opposite. Only she had not noticed yet. I said I did not build this to hand it back to someone who walked away when it got inconvenient. I said, "You did me a favor that night, even if you did not mean to." Her eyes filled, and for a split second I felt the old reflex to comfort. Then it passed, like a habit finally broken. She asked if there was any chance, and I said no, simply, without anger, without explanation. Just no. She stood there, waiting for a softer ending, a loophole. But there was none. I thanked her for stopping by, because politeness is a powerful boundary, and I closed the door, gently, the same way she had done a year ago. I leaned against it for a second, not because I was shaken, but because I was amazed at how different it felt on this side. And I realized the victory was not in her regret. It was in my indifference, and that realization settled into me like something permanent. After the door closed for good, I did not feel triumphant. There was no dramatic music in my head, just a deep calm. The kind that shows up when something unresolved finally stops asking for attention. I went back to the kitchen, poured cereal into a bowl, and laughed at how ordinary everything felt after what could have been a life-altering conversation. That was the moment I understood how far I had come. A year ago, her words had dismantled me. Now her presence barely rearranged my evening. The next few weeks were busy in the best way, projects overlapping, meetings scheduled weeks out, money moving through accounts like it belonged there, not recklessly, not desperately, but steadily. I started mentoring a younger entrepreneur who reminded me of myself before I learned certain lessons the hard way. He asked me once how I handled pressure when things fall apart, and I surprised myself with the answer. I said I stopped attaching my identity to people who benefited from my stability but disappeared during my struggle. He nodded like that sentence would come back to him later. I ran into my ex one last time, unintentionally, at a mutual friend's gathering. She kept her distance, polite, almost cautious, like someone who had finally read the room. We exchanged a brief hello, nothing more, and that was enough. I did not feel the need to explain myself to anyone there. Not our history, not my choices. My life no longer required footnotes. I started traveling more, not to escape, but to expand. New cities, new conversations, no rush to impress anyone. I dated casually, learned what I actually wanted, which turned out to be peace, consistency, and laughter that did not come with conditions. One night, I sat on a hotel balcony in a city I used to dream about visiting someday, and I thought about that Christmas Eve again, not with bitterness, but with perspective. If she had stayed, if she had waited, I might never have stripped my life down to what mattered. Comfort would have made me complacent. Loss forced me to become precise. And that precision became power. I realized success did not arrive to prove her wrong. It arrived because I finally stopped negotiating my worth. The irony still made me smile. She wanted certainty and chose money. I chose uncertainty and built something real. And in the end, only one of those things held up. I checked my phone, a message from my team celebrating another milestone. And I felt something close to pride. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind that does not need witnesses. I went inside, closed the balcony door, and prepared for the next day, not because I had to, but because I wanted to, and that choice made all the difference. The future that finally felt intentional. By the time another Christmas rolled around, I barely noticed the date. Until someone mentioned it in a meeting. The season no longer carried that sharp edge. It was just time passing, neutral again. My business had crossed a line I used to think was reserved for other people, the kind with advisors, long-term planning, and conversations that started with "Where do you want this to be in 5 years?" instead of "How do we survive next month?" I moved into a new place, not bigger, just better designed. Sunlight in the morning, quiet at night. A space that felt like a reflection instead of a compromise. I hosted friends there, cooked badly but confidently, told stories that no longer ended with a sigh. Someone asked once if I ever regretted how things ended, and I answered honestly, no, because regret assumes there was a better version of that path, and I do not believe there was. I believe some people are lessons that only make sense after they leave. I heard through mutual circles that my ex had moved again, changed jobs, changed cities, still searching for something she could not name. And for the first time, I wished her well without irony. Not because she deserved redemption from me, but because I no longer needed her to be anything for my story to make sense. One afternoon, I found the old divorce papers while cleaning out a drawer. I read the first page, smiled at how formal it all sounded, and recycled them without ceremony. The past does not need archiving when the present is full. I thought about how close I came to believing her words, that I was not enough, that my value was temporary, tied to income graphs and quarterly results, and I felt grateful I never accepted that narrative as truth. Life did not reward me for suffering. It responded when I took responsibility for what came next, and that realization stayed with me, steady and grounding, like something I could carry forward. The ending that did not need applause. People love neat endings. A final scene where everyone understands the lesson at the same time. Real life is quieter than that. My ending did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived on an ordinary morning when I woke up without thinking about proving anything to anyone. I made coffee, checked messages from my team, reviewed plans for the next quarter, and felt content in a way that did not ask for validation. That was how I knew the story had shifted, not because my ex regretted her choice, not because money flowed again, but because my sense of self no longer fluctuated with other people's decisions. Sometimes I replay that Christmas Eve in my head, not to punish myself, but to remind myself how clearly life speaks when it wants you to listen. She thought she was closing a door on a future that disappointed her. She did not realize she was opening one for me. I did not win because she lost. I won because I stayed. I stayed with the work, with the discomfort, with the rebuilding. When things fell apart, I did not chase replacements. I built foundations, and that made all the difference. If there is a lesson here, it is not about money or revenge or timing. It is about dignity, about knowing that being left does not mean being less. It just means being free to become more. I no longer measure years by who stands beside me. I measure them by how honestly I live them. And that is a future no one can take away, not on Christmas Eve, not ever.